So if you find this sleep story helpful or interesting, then give it a thumbs up, leave any comments that you've got below, and if you aren't already, subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you can receive notifications of when future sleep stories go live. I have dozens and dozens of stories already on my channel that you can go and search. I also release new stories every single week, so I hope you enjoy this story.
So as you take a moment to listen to me telling this story, you can begin to get yourself comfortable, close your eyes, and start to drift off asleep. And as you drift asleep, I don't know whether you'll drift asleep faster with the sound of my words or the spaces between my words. And as you drift asleep, so I'll just be telling this story in the background. And there was a woman who went up to bed, turning off the lights as she went. And she sat in her bed, with just a light on beside her bed. And she sat there in her bed, back resting deeply in some comfortable pillows, feeling calm, feeling just the right temperature for drifting and floating asleep in bed. And she sat in bed a while under the relaxing light of the lamp, reading a book. And she calmly and peacefully read one page, then turned the page and read the next page, and the next page, and then turned the page and read the next page. And she sat there for a little while, absorbed in the story in the book. And after a little while she closed up that book, placed the book beside the bed, turned off the light, plumped up the pillows a little bit, slid down in the bed, pulled the covers up higher around her chin, tucked herself in comfortably, and began to drift and float asleep. And as she began to drift asleep, she was aware there was just the slightest bit of moonlight shining into her room. She was aware that she could hear the slight breeze outside on the window, some distant sounds outside. As she continued to feel comfortable, drifting asleep in bed. And while she was drifting asleep in bed, so she started to feel like her body was relaxing, getting heavier, and she would occasionally see little glimmers of shapes and colours in her mind's eye. And then as she began to drift into a dream, she found herself walking toward a pyramid in Egypt. And it wasn't Egypt as she had seen on TV. It was Egypt as she imagined it probably was centuries earlier. There was lots of greenery, lots of plant life. And she walked through it all, walking towards a pyramid. And the pyramid stood so tall, and she was aware that it was probably taller than it appeared as she walked toward it. And the sides of the pyramid looked so smooth and almost pure white, with the sun shining and reflecting off the side that's facing it. And the pyramid stood out, being such a pure white, compared to the green of the plants around it. And as she continued to drift deeper asleep, so she continued to drift deeper into this dream. And the deeper she began to go into the dream, the more she began to hear hustle and bustle of people going about their lives. And she walked all the way to the pyramid, walked to its entrance. And she took a torch from beside the pyramid and walked into the pyramid. And unlike pyramids that she had seen on TV, this pyramid had a large entrance. Almost like a large entrance hall that led into a room. And so she walked down that entrance hall, hearing her footsteps echoing as she went, noticing the way shadows danced on the walls, hearing the sound of the flame of the torch, as the breeze that blew through this pyramid blew that flame and made that flame dance on the stick. And she noticed that there was a coolness to being in the pyramid compared to being outside the pyramid. And she walked all the way through to a room, to a vast chamber. And this chamber was so large that the light from the torch barely reached the sides or the ceiling. And she walked to one side and noticed that deep in this pyramid, in this chamber, there seemed to be water. And she walked down the side of the pyramid, down the side of this chamber. And she saw that there was a boat beside her resting on the water. She climbed into that boat. She placed the torch in a holder at the front of the boat, picked up an oar, pushed off the side, unsure what she was going to find, and started rowing through the water, with the sound of that oar as it pushed through the water on one side, and then she would cross it over the boat and push it on the other side. then cross it over the boat and push it on the other side. And she assumed that she would just be on this boat to the back of the pyramid, perhaps to the back of this chamber. But she noticed that the boat was subtly getting pulled in one direction, and she was unsure where she was going, but decided to go with the flow. And so she went with the flow, and she could see that she was approaching the back wall of the chamber, and see that over in the corner was a gap large enough for the boat to fit through. And over at that gap, as she approached it, she could hear the water getting louder, almost like rapids. And as the boat reached that corner, suddenly it began to speed up and started flowing down these rapids, down a secret tunnel at the back of this chamber, almost like being in a water slide at a theme park. And the boat increased in speed as it travelled around these tunnels, curving one way, following that water, and then curving down another way, descending somewhere deep under the pyramid, before eventually leaping out the end over a small waterfall and landing in a calmer lake, in an area that appeared to be lit up like daylight. And yet she was aware that she's deep underground. And she could hear birds singing. She could see trees, plants, grass, shrubs. And so she rowed that boat ashore, climbed out of the boat, pulled the boat up onto the bank, and decided to explore this area. She didn't know where she was, but there seemed to be a whole world down here, somewhere deep under these pyramids. And she didn't know how the sky was being lit up in this cave. When she looked up, it just looked almost like a normal blue sky. And she walked along the side of the lake. And she could see something glistening off in the distance. Something that was reflective and catching her gaze as she moved. And so she walked towards that. She circled around the lake, headed off across a meadow between some trees. And arrived at what seemed to be a giant golden temple covered in purple and blue stones, making out pictures around this golden temple. And she walked around this temple, seeing what seemed like the largest piece of gold she'd ever seen in her life. And this temple was almost like perhaps half the size of one of the pyramids that she had seen outside. And she navigated her way round the temple and then found an entrance and walked into that entrance. And light from outside the temple was bounced around inside the temple from crystals that seemed to line it. And so, walking into the temple, she noticed how her footsteps had a weird echo, a kind of echo that had a certain dullness to it as she walked. And she found her way easily directed, following the path into the temple, through to the centre of this temple. And in the centre of the temple was a sarcophagus. And this sarcophagus was made of pure gold, with the most beautiful depiction of the person inside. And she read what it said along the outside of the sarcophagus, that here lies the master of all masters, the one who created the land, and that they lie in the land beneath the land. To be a master of their own land, while others inherit what they've left behind. And she finds this fascinating. And she leaves the tomb and decides to explore further. And she knows that there's got to be some kind of ecosystem down here, because she doesn't know how long this has been here, but she knows it's obviously been here a very long time. And she can hear birds, and there's obviously plants, and there may well be other animals. So she decides to explore. She's sure that she can't be the only one who knows of this place. And as she explores, so she sees what looks like a village in the distance. And wherever this is that she is such a huge space that if this is in a cave underground, she can't see the sides of the cave, despite it being well lit. The land just seems to go on in every direction. And so she starts to walk towards that village, taking in the sounds of the birds, feeling long grass at her fingertips as she walks through that grass, feeling a slight breeze on her face, and the comfortable temperature of this area, and finding this to be such a tranquil location. And as she nears that village, so she notices there are people milling around. There are people farming, people making things. There's a whole community down here, wherever here is. And she goes over to one of the villagers and begins to talk to them, and by surprise they seem to understand her and she seems to be able to understand them. And she asks them where this place is, what they're all doing here, how long they've been here. And they explain that they're the guardians of the tomb, that their ancestors came here with the first pharaoh, and they've been here ever since, looking after the tomb, tending to the tomb, looking after this land, ensuring the survival of this land. And that generation after generation of them have lived down here. And that down here they live in peace and harmony. And the woman gets invited to eat with them. And so she eats with these people. And down here it was almost like the sun beginning to set, and yet she sees no sun in the sky. And she's curious where this is, how it all works. And one of the villagers explains that none of them really know, that this place was created at the death of the first pharaoh. That their ancestors may well have known how it was created, but they don't believe that it was a man-made place. And she looks around and thinks to herself that she also doesn't believe it's man-made. That thought of being able to create a space this large underground and to make it so full of life and an entire ecosystem just wouldn't be possible. And she asked them how far they've travelled. And they said that they've travelled all over the land. They've never found a boundary. And she's curious about this. How you can never find a boundary. How this space can be that large. And that evening, they invite her to stay the night. And she settles down in a chair, relaxing in a room with a flickering fire in the corner of the room. And a little kitten playing on the ground, rolling around with something, kicking it around, holding it with its front paws, kicking it with its back legs, flipping on its back. Then after a little bit, that kitten gets bored and walks over to the woman sat in that seat, jumps up and climbs up her legs and onto her lap, and the kitten slumps itself down like a limp weight in her lap, and she instinctively begins to gently stroke that kitten as the kitten sits in her lap, purring and relaxing, with its eyes closed, resting on her lap. And she can feel the breathing of that kitten, its body moving in and out with each breath. As that kitten relaxes and purrs, and she can feel the vibrating purring of that kitten resting on her lap. And while the kitten drifts asleep, purring on her lap, so she drifts comfortably and relaxed asleep. And then the next morning, she awakens and can see that kitten playing on the floor again. She has some breakfast, leaves the building, and says she's going to have a little look around before heading back to where she came from. And she didn't know for sure how she was going to get back, because the route here was all downhill. But she thought she'd figure that out. And so she began to look around. And as she looked around, so she just noticed a tree that stood out among the others as being that much taller and looking so healthy. She walked over to that tree, ran her fingers round the bark of the tree, felt that tree, and felt there was something unusual about the tree. And she noticed that there was a small hole in the bottom of the tree. It just looked like a natural hole you get in many trees, but she felt compelled to take a closer look. And when she did, she saw a box hidden in that hole. She took the box out from that hole, carefully opened the box, and as she did, so what looked like a hologram of a person appeared before her. And she was startled for a moment, and then they began talking to her, asking her who she is, why she's opened the box. And she explained who she was, and that she stumbled across this box, and is curious about this place. And they explained what this place was, that this was a message from that first civilization. That was a technologically advanced civilization. And that what had happened was that the river, the rapids, that the woman had come down on and come into this place on actually lead to an alternative world. It's actually a portal through space to a different place, to a different world. A world that this first civilization started their civilization on, but had left long ago to become a spacefaring civilization, where some of the civilizations settled on Earth, and the first of their kind on any planet always make sure that there's a portal they take with them that they can place somewhere that will lead them home. And that portal had been placed and led to here. And the woman wondered how she was going to get back. And they said that although she can't take that boat back, she can climb back through the portal, climb up the side of the waterfall, up the side of the rapids, that it'll be possible to climb up to where she came from. And she knew this would be a hard task. And so she closed that box and the hologram disappeared. She placed that box back where she found it. And she headed back to where she came from. She climbed up the waterfall, entered the tunnel, and carrying the torch to light her way, she scrambled her way all the way back to the pyramid. And came out in the pyramid, waded through that water over to near where she got the boat from. Exited the pyramid and walked out into the heat of Egypt. And as she felt herself drying off in the Egyptian sun, so she felt this dream drifting, floating away, as she drifted and relaxed into a deeper, more profound sleep.